The Cotswold Hills in the heart of England. The ancient towns of Cirencester, Tetbury and Stroud enclose an area of the country which has hardly changed in 200 years. It's a great attraction for tourists, and it's popular with royalty too. The Prince and Princess of Wales live here. But this area has another claim to fame that's not so widely known. Leighterton and its neighbouring village of Minchinhampton witnessed the birth of the Royal Australian Air Force. These graves at Leighterton remind us that there were once ANZACs over England. How did 24 young men from down under end their days in this corner of an English field, some of them months after the end of the war? To answer that question, we need to go back to 1918, to a time when Britain was still engaged in a deadly fight for survival. Gallipoli had been evacuated in 1915, and the raw courage of the Anzac volunteers had been duly noted. Those who survived the slaughter were sent to France, and here again proved themselves fit to die for the motherland. Australia and New Zealand sent 330,000 men to fight for the empire. 60,000 were killed in France and Gallipoli, and many of the men who lie here experienced those battlefields. They were trainee fighter pilots, and they belonged to the Australian Flying Corps, the forerunner of today's Royal Australian Air Force. They were based at two Cotswold airfields, Leighterton and Minchinhampton. Recruits from the Dominions, such as Canada, New Zealand and Australia, were mainly integrated into British units. Why then did Australia have its own air force?
Well, in 1911, here in a meeting in London, it was decided that the Dominions would have their own flying corps, but in fact Australia was the only country to take that up. Well, they had a minimal expertise. They had a flying school operating, and they had some trained people. The United Kingdom was badly in need of more pilots, and Australia was able to train pilots for the war effort.
Aircraft technology developed rapidly, the needs of warfare providing the spur. By 1917, the Australian Flying Corps had progressed from its original 5 box kites at Point Cook, Victoria, to this sophisticated machine, used extensively in training at Minchinhampton and Leighterton. The Sopwith Camel. With its 140 horsepower rotary engine, it was capable of 109 miles per hour, and although British built, it was designed by a team which included the legendary Australian aviator Harry Hawker. Other machines used in training included the SE-5, the Avro 504 and the Bristol fighter. All those machines were used at Leighterton and here at Minchinhampton Airfield, now the home of the Cotswold Gliding Club. Australia insisted on having its own air force in order to prepare for the defence of its own shores after the war. 4 squadrons of the AFC saw action in France and Egypt, and with the escalation of the war in the skies, it was decided to form 4 more training squadrons, based in England. And so the Australian invasion of the Cotswold Hills began. In the autumn of 1917, a gang of Canadian foresters cut timber from the surrounding woods to make temporary Besonneau hangars. They were canvas-clad, but the frames were strong enough to survive to the present day, as was the influence the Anzacs had on this rural backwater. Thousands of tons of concrete were poured into the fields at Leighterton and Minchinhampton to make foundations for permanent hangars. Plans were drawn up for headquarters, administrative buildings, workshops and barracks for the pilots, mechanics, riggers and fitters who would occupy this area for the rest of the war. In charge of the whole operation was Lieutenant Colonel Oswald Watt. Watt was educated at Clifton College, Bristol and Cambridge University, But despite this, he was an Australian to his fingertips. "I am an Australian," he said, "and I don't have any manners." He was obsessed with flying. He obtained his pilot's licence in 1911, having been trained at the Bristol School on Salisbury Plain. In 1914, impatient to fight the Germans, he joined the French d'Aviation Militaire, taking his aeroplane with him. By 1916, he had received the Croix de Guerre with palms and the Médaille Militaire for his daring reconnaissance work behind enemy lines. In December 1917, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and took command of the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th Training Squadrons from his wing headquarters in Tetbury. He can be seen here walking behind General Birdwood, who was on an official visit of inspection to Minchinhampton in 1918. Watt was just one of many remarkable Australian pilots posted to Leighterton or Minchinhampton as flying instructors. Highly decorated air aces such as Harry Cobby, Australia's top-scoring fighter pilot. Captain Gordon Campbell Wilson, MC, DCM, AFC. The fun-loving Tabby Flaum. Major R.C. Phillips. Captain Les Holden, who made a great impression on Lionel Paydin.
There was one aircraft there, a red SE-5, and we got to see this aircraft regularly mornings racing up the valley from Stroud towards Sapperton, very low, and when it got to Chelmsford it had to climb steeply because the valley ended towards Sapperton, and it was we found out that it was flown by Captain Holden, who it is said, or at least this is what we were told, that he used to get up mornings and before he had his breakfast he would go out, jump in his aircraft, do a fast flight round the area, race back up the valley, land and then go back into breakfast.
Local people had never seen the like of these brash, devil-may-care young men from down under.
We were boys who'd been brought up in the years of the Great War, and we knew something about flying. We'd heard of it, you see. And lo and behold, the very things we'd read about in newspapers or heard our parents talk about, here they were overhead. And we were absolutely fascinated by what we saw. My most vivid recollection is of the maneuverability of the planes flown by the Australian airmen. They did all sorts of maneuvers and stunts that left us literally gasping, I think. There was a usual loop-the-loop. They were doing those to a penny. A very unusual maneuver called the falling leaf, where the plane seemed to drift down towards the earth as a falling leaf might come off a tree. And also something extraordinary, which I believe was called the Immelmann turn, some maneuver they had copied from the German air forces.
Well, my family have been here quite a few generations, but one of the most interesting times, of course, was during the First World War, when the Australian Air Force had a training aerodrome a few fields away, and they used to come over here and sometimes land in front of the house to have coffee in the mornings. Of course, this was completely unofficial, and with the trees round about, sometimes slightly unfortunate accidents occurred. Here's an aeroplane which ended up in a tree close to the house, and we've actually got the propeller boss from it and a bit of the propeller. Grandfather and grandmother were living here then, and they entertained these Australians quite a lot in the house, and at the end of the war they presented us with this album of books, which is of Australian Flying Corps First Wing, Tetbury, Gloucestershire. When they came over here to Chavenage and landed close by, just in front of the house in the park, they used to give members of my family joy rides.
Oh, really?
My grandmother went up and insisted on being given a loop-the-loop experience. When she arrived back on terra firma, she asked her pilot what these straps were for, and of course they were her safety belt, which she had forgotten to do up. But she survived, didn't fall out.
At nearby Badminton House, the Duke of Beaufort's hunt was sometimes joined by Australian Flying Corps officers. On one notable occasion, they came with their aeroplanes, which created havoc on the ground. Enraged, the Duke demanded that those responsible be sent back to the Western Front immediately. But Colonel Watt's diplomatic skills saved the day. And while he hobnobbed with the gentry, the lower ranks joined in with the rest of the community in a variety of ways.
One local lad, who was quite a humorist, called Frank Hill, he used to come in very often to the local shop and relate some of the amusing things that he'd been up to. He was well known for nonsense, and apparently he had been dressing up as a girl, and for a few weeks had been courted by an Australian airman, and they apparently used to walk around together. I suppose it was the time of the year when you couldn't see much in the way of light, and on one occasion they were walking up Cowcombe Hill, and to be very polite, I think an improper suggestion was made by the airman to Frank, who promptly, so it is said, picked up his skirts and ran back down the hill.
The thing that the Australians seemed to feature in most in the public mind was taking part in local carnivals, fancy dress parades organised to raise money for war funds, you know, the usual thing, national savings and that sort of thing. And they caused terrific excitement and some degree of scandal because of the rather saucy way they got themselves depicted as girls and so forth, you see, using cottage loaves to give themselves a good bosom and all this sort of, that's the tale. And they were noted for being full of fun.
An Australian night's entertainment called the Welcome Nugget entertained a large audience for 2 hours. The stage was converted into a gold mining camp, and a life-size model aeroplane was seen to collapse. It was all very funny, but the same newspaper carried a report of an accident earlier that day. Lieutenant E.H. Jeffreys, Lieutenant C.W. Scott, and Second Lieutenant Cummings were killed today. The latter two officers were in a two-seater machine and the former a single-seater flying at 15,000 feet. Half a mile from the aerodrome, one machine turned right, the other turned left, and a collision occurred. The three officers were killed instantly. The daredevil antics, the flamboyance, and the cheerful attitudes of the young Anzacs could not disguise the very real fears and dangers that they lived with daily. The main purpose of the whole operation was to learn fighting skills for the Western Front, which in those early days of flying and in those primitive machines was an extremely hazardous business.
I used to deliver the telegrams for the local post office, which included very many trips during the week to Minchinhampton Aerodrome, as it was called in those days. And there were all sorts of occasions in that when there was special events going on, which the personnel up there allowed me to stop and watch for a short time. I remember particularly one telegram that I was asked to deliver. I got up to the aerodrome and reported into the guard room, and the personnel there asked me who it was for, and I said, I handed in the telegram, and he looked at me and he said, well, young man, he said, that's one telegram that you won't be able to deliver. He said it was addressed to Flight Lieutenant Dudley Shepherd, and he had been killed that morning in a crash on the aerodrome.
By midsummer 1918, a dozen young Anzacs had been killed. Their average age was 24. Why did so many young men die in training? These were very early days in aviation, and the Sopwith Camel, which features often in the catalogue of accidents, was a notoriously difficult aeroplane to fly. Tom Sopwith himself described it as a vicious little beast.
This is a rotary engine, which is the type of engine where the crankshaft remains still and the engine itself goes around with the propeller, which I can demonstrate to you, because the propeller goes around, the whole of the engine goes around with it. You've got this huge piece of metal whirling round at very high revolutions per minute, and so it would set up a gyroscopic action on the front of the aircraft, which would make it very difficult to manoeuvre. Sometimes it would go very easily and perhaps too quickly in one direction and be very hard to make it turn at all in the other direction. And this had a problem because in those days pilots were not aware of how to correct a spin, and if an airplane was in a spin, then it was almost certainly going to be fatal.
For the time, this aircraft represented the pinnacle of technological achievement. How incredible they must have appeared to the inhabitants of this area, for whom even the motor car was a rarity.
One day there was an enormous excitement because an aeroplane, no less, was seen to be coming out of the sky and finally landed in a field about a quarter of a mile from the school playground. The impact of this was enormous, and without hesitation, large numbers of the scholars just left school and ran over to see the plane that had come down. It may have been in the lunch period, I don't know. I'm sorry to say I wasn't among the more brave elements, and I didn't run over to see the plane in the first instance. But and when the headmaster, who was a bit of a martinet and a disciplinarian, discovered what was happening, he assembled the whole school. I don't know quite how he managed it, caned all those who'd run off to see the aeroplane without permission, and told those of us who hadn't, the best behaved ones, that we could go and see them as long as we liked.
All dogs were looked upon by the Australian lorry drivers as dingoes, I take it, because dogs were killed regularly, almost every day. One could hear of a dog being killed. In fact, if any dog escaped, he became quite notorious.
On Armistice Day in November 1918, the Anzacs went wild. It is said that some of them took a Bowser into the main street in Tetbury, spilled petrol down its entire length and set fire to it. In Stroud at 10 o'clock in the evening, the town was invaded by 200 Australians who, with their band, kept up a lively din until the small hours. They played and sang, and a number of the fair sex joined in. This is the Leighterton flag, now on exhibition at Point Cook, Victoria, with a cartoon showing the armistice celebrations in Cirencester. So it was, by the end of the war, a total of 17 graves were in this field at Leighterton. On the 18th of November, a memorial service was held. The war was over, and the Anzacs waited for their transport home. In the more relaxed atmosphere, social activities increased. The officers spent many happy evenings at the King's Head Hotel in Cirencester. more concert parties were organised and toured the district to great acclaim. Now, the Australians mixed freely with local girls, which resulted in several marriages.
One of the Australian airmen enjoyed the area so much that he not only married a local girl, but he also, after the cessation of hostilities, he began a bus company in Stroud known as the Red Bus Company. And to make it quite an Australian feature, the garage where the buses were kept was called the Austro Garage in Lansdowne, Stroud. The motive on the bus was a kangaroo.
But the end of the war was not the end of the Anzac fatalities. On the 4th of February 1919, Lieutenant John Henry Weingarth from Sydney had a fatal accident in an Avro 504 while going to the aid of a stranded pupil. At 26, he was the only AFC flying instructor to be killed in the Cotswolds. And on the very last day of training on March the 21st, 1919, 4 months after Armistice Day, the last Anzac to be killed was buried. He was Cadet Keane, whose aircraft struck a tree in bad weather. There are now 24 graves at Leighterton and a number of others in various village churchyards in the Cotswolds. Those who survived sailed home on May the 6th, 1919 on the troop ship Kaiser I. Hind. It was these men and a number of their colleagues who formed the basis of today's Royal Australian Air Force. Among those who sailed was the commanding officer Toby Watt, who had himself less than 2 years to live. He drowned in the sea near his home, Bilgola, near Sydney, at the age of 42. The pallbearers at his funeral included Major Blake, Major Scott, Captain Malley and Captain Holden, men who had been with him at Leighterton and Minchinhampton. In leaving England, the Anzacs did not forget the friends they'd made. This is Remembrance Sunday in the village of Minchinhampton. The Aussies gave a final farewell concert in the village hall over there, and the money from the proceeds of that concert in the spring of 1919 helped to pay for this memorial in the village here. When they left the area, the hangars, which by this time were made of brick, were used for a short time by the RAF. But by 1921, the airfield at Leighterton was abandoned and the hangars demolished. The vast complex was sold off as scrap. You can just see up there a sign that says, "Absolutely no smoking." From this you may surmise that this was probably the shed where the Australians repaired and tested the aeroplane engines. This looks very much like scrubland, but the trees and shrubs you see growing here have sprung up since the Australians left 70 years ago. And beneath the grass is a mass of solid concrete. Little remains now of the occupation. This cafe and garage were erected soon after the war on the site of the old officers' mess.
The Australians that have been back have taken us round and shown us where they slept. One slept just at the back there. There was a hut at the back and they slept there. And another slept somewhere else on another patch of concrete that's gone. And that's how it went, yeah.
Have you had many visitors from Australia?
Yeah, lots of them. Yes, lots of them. One old chap came back, about 6 years running, every year for Anzac Day.
It's hard to imagine this place swarming with Anzacs. But every April in the cemetery at Leighterton, there's a special Anzac Day service, attended by local people. And they will never forget that there were once ANZACS over England.
It's a very popular service, and I'm very glad that it's still carried on, because I'm sure the Australians appreciate that very much.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.
There was one period in the history of Stroud when visitors from Australia had an enormous impact on the population, which has never been forgotten. And that was the arrival of the first members of the Australian Flying Corps to set up a base near the town for training purposes. 70 years have passed since then, but it is remarkable how the impact of those days has never been forgotten. And there are little links and things which come up from time to time that recall a remarkable year, or 14 months I think it was, in the history of this locality.